Hello, my name is Jambareeqi, and joining me for an interview is renowned animator and story artist Floyd Norman. He has worked for such studios as Walt Disney Animation, Pixar Studios, and Hanna-Barbera Entertainment. Thank you for joining me, Floyd.
Happy to be here.
Now, first of all, what are you currently up to lately, and which studios are you working for, and what roles do you have within those studios?
Well, first of all, I'll have to let everybody know that I'm retired. Actually, I retired 10 years ago, and but I never stopped working. So even though I am officially retired from Walt Disney Animation Studios, I still do work for the company. I spent about 10 years in Disney's publishing department back when I was a full-time employee. So I do books on occasion, but I also do other things. And because I'm no longer under contract at Disney, I'm allowed to work for other studios as well. So I do a bit of freelancing. I work on a feature or a TV show here and there. Whenever a friend or a colleague calls me, I'm ready to jump in and help out.
This actually sounds like a very interesting life to lead. It gives you a lot of freedom then, right?
It does. It does indeed.
So what kind of projects do you contribute to now that you're retired?
Well, I love both films and I love books as well. And I think a good example might be last year, where I was an illustrator on probably around six children's books at Disney Publishing. Um, Three of the books were for Pixar, Monsters Incorporated, which was a film I worked on nearly 10 years ago. I worked on Monsters Incorporated. And of course, the new film that'll be out this summer, Monsters University. So we're back doing a lot of monster books. So I did three books as an illustrator, but I also did three princess books, The Little Mermaid, Snow White, and Sleeping Beauty. Sleeping Beauty, a film that I worked on way back in the 50s, 1958 to be exact. So I do that. And then, of course, I do work on television shows. A friend of mine was directing a show for Cartoon Network, needed a storyboard artist, and so I came and worked on that as well. And we're doing a series of Mickey Mouse books, the work of the wonderful Floyd Gottfredson, who started writing and drawing Mickey Mouse back in the 1930s. And we're doing a series of Mickey Mouse books, kind of a celebration of Floyd Gottfredson's work. So I've been working with the editors on that book series as well. So you see, I do a lot of different things.
Well, those all sound really interesting. So do you do anything original, anything of your own?
Yes, I do. I guess I'm always drawing my cartoon gags. It's kind of been a hobby of mine since the early days of Disney. So on occasion, I will put together a series of cartoon gags, and they're usually about the animation business. And I'll self-publish, and I get together about 100 gags I've drawn. And more recently, I've started doing these gags in full color, so that gives me the opportunity to do a gag book that's not just black and white line drawings, but full color sketches. So that's kind of like my own work. It's more of a hobby than a job. I just do it for fun. And of course, I've recently completed my new book, Animated Life, which details my several decades at the Walt Disney Company. And that book is finally shipped, and I think it's available everywhere now. I've gotten fan mail from Europe, from the UK, and from the United States. So that book and others that I might be thinking about, that's also a personal project, the kind of things I like to do personally.
So how sincere and honest is this autobiographical book of yours?
Well, people have asked me, is my book an autobiography? And I said, no, it's not really a book about me. It's a book about my career at Disney. So it's really a Disney book. And I wrote the book to give young animation artists, young animation students, some insight on what the Walt Disney Studio was like decades ago. I started work for Disney in the 1950s. Now, that's for a lot of kids, the 1950s, that's a long time ago.
Mm.
But it was a very exciting time to come to work for Walt Disney. It was the time when Walt Disney was still there and ran his company. So I wanted to write all this down to share what I experienced in the 50s, in the 60s, and in the 70s at the Walt Disney Company.
So would you say it's more of a history book than a biographical book?
Oh yeah, yeah. It's not really a biography. It's probably more of a history book in that sense, because I had the opportunity to work with so many great people, and I wanted to share those experiences.
I see, I see. Now, I want to go back in time a bit. I would like to know the first ever moment that a young Floyd Norman realized, I want to do animation. What was the thing that inspired you to think animation is what I want to do?
Well, that probably goes all the way back to my childhood when I was probably 5 or 6 years old, and my mother took me to see Walt Disney's Bambi, and I was just a child, so I knew I was going to the movies. I knew that I wasn't watching real life, but I had never seen animation before. Keep in mind, this was before we had, television. There was no way to see animation except at a movie theater. And so my mother took me to the theater and to see Bambi, and I saw these moving drawings on the screen, and I was completely fascinated because these were drawings that moved and talked. And I said, when I grow up, I want to do magic like that.
That's very fascinating.
Yeah, it is. It is.
So, like, after seeing Bambi, was that the moment you realized that I would love to contribute to this? I know you were really young, but did you realize that you wanted to be involved with this industry after you saw Bambi?
Oh, yes, indeed. I think I knew, even as a small child, that I wanted to be an artist. I mean, I wanted to draw pictures for a living. I just didn't know what kind of pictures. And once I saw animated films, it kind of, everything came together for me. Even as a child, I knew the kind of drawings I wanted to do were drawings that moved. I could tell a story in pictures. And animation was just the perfect vehicle. I mean, I loved movies, I loved comic books, and I loved drawing. Well, animation pulled all of these disciplines together, and it became the perfect job.
So, how did you express this newfound fondness for animation? Did you start making your own comics or making your own animations? And
Oh, yes. Yeah, I did. And I found that what I was doing was not that unusual. When I talked to many colleagues and even young students in recent years, I found out that they did pretty much what I did when I was a kid. I made my own comic books, mainly for my own amusement, and I would sometimes show them to my pals. I began when it was possible to buy a home movie camera. My parents and my grandparents helped me purchase the movie camera, and I began to make my own animated films. While I was in middle school, I began to be a filmmaker. And by the time I got to high school, I was thinking really seriously about making films, and that kind of like became part of my education. One high school project was to film a documentary, and we gathered together a bunch of students who became our writers, our cameramen, our editors, and we were a small movie company right in high school. So I think I began becoming a filmmaker even when I was still a kid, even before I became a professional. I was already making films.
so, what were these student films about?
Well, largely we made films just for fun. That's how it all starts. You make films just to show to your pals because you think, oh, this is a lot of fun, and we can go out and shoot movies of each other. In time, we began to see a need to. We realized we could actually do a movie and make it a class project. In a sense, it was making our movie making legitimate. We told our teacher, we can do a movie, we can involve the entire classroom, and it would not only be producing a motion picture, but we would be learning the subject matter as well. And so I remember one particular film, it involved students who had come to our hometown of Santa Barbara. I grew up in Santa Barbara, California. And so we would have exchange students. We would send American students abroad, and students from Europe would come to America. And we wanted to document what that experience might be like. Now, of course, we couldn't go to Europe to shoot what it was like to be an American in Europe, but we could shoot in America, what it was like to be a foreign student in America, and involved the entire class in that project. And so that's what we did. Our classmates became writers, became filmmakers. And so it was kind of like, having the best of both worlds. We were doing our classwork, but also making a movie as well.
It must have been a really exciting process, actually. I'd love
It
to do
was.
something like that. I'd love to find an excuse in one of my lessons that wasn't fond of, and thought, you know what, can I make a film about this?
Yes.
Yeah, so that's quite original. That's a very original process.
Well, filmmaking became possible even back in the 1950s because we had cameras and film that was finally affordable. We shot our film on 16 millimeter, and we used a Bolex camera, and it didn't cost a good deal of money to make a film back then. It was still fairly expensive. It would be even cheaper today with high definition video. But even back then, even back in the 1950s, film was relatively inexpensive. And so filmmaking was not out of the question.
So did any of these student films have the freedom to use sound, or did you have to work with complete silence?
Yeah, that was the one thing we didn't have. We didn't have the advantage of sound, which meant we had to shoot everything silently. But we did add a narration track later and a music track. So even though we basically shot a silent film, we were able to add sound to it later in post-production. Today, with high-definition video with sound already part of the package, it would be a lot easier to make a sound film today and even edit the film using computer technology. But we didn't have those tools back in the 1950s, so we did what we could. But we still produced a pretty decent-looking film, and it was a lot of fun doing it.
Mm. So, at which point did you decide to embrace a career at Disney? Because I know you were very young at this point. So, at which point or which age did you decide to head towards Disney and show your portfolio?
Well, I think I'd already decided that I wanted to work for Walt Disney, even when I was still a kid, a fairly young kid in middle school. It wasn't until I got to high school that I began to become, even more serious about a career at Disney. And I didn't really know exactly what that might entail. I didn't know the first thing about getting a job at a Hollywood movie studio. Luckily for me, Disney was not that far away. I lived in Santa Barbara, and that was only 90 miles away from Burbank. So I could easily get into my car and drive down to Burbank if I could somehow manage to get a meeting at the Walt Disney Studio. So once I graduated from high school in Santa Barbara, this was back in 1953, I was actually able, through a friend who managed to get me an appointment, and we drove down on a Saturday morning and spoke with a representative at the Walt Disney Studio.
And so what did the representative think of your work when you showed it?
Well, he was very honest and forthright, and that was good. He thought my work showed promise. But he did tell me that the important thing I needed to do was go to school. I needed to go to school and learn how to become a professional artist. So he gave me good advice. And so, taking that advice, I enrolled at the Art Center College of Design, a 4-year course to become a professional artist. Well, it was in my 3rd year at Art Center that I received a call from Walt Disney, that is the Walt Disney Studio, telling me that they still had a job available and did I want it. And naturally, I jumped at the opportunity.
So what was your instinctive feeling once you had been granted this dream job of yours?
Well, I immediately dropped out of school. That was the first thing I did. And I told the representative who called me, who said that they had a position open if I could be there 8 o'clock Monday morning. And this was on a Friday when I received the phone call. And I said, no problem. I said, I will be at the Walt Disney Studio bright and early Monday morning. And I was. So that's how my career with Disney began.
And so what was your first ever job at the Disney Studio?
Well, I'd have to explain the way it worked in those days. animation was still regarded as a rather quirky position. Uh, Most people didn't even view being a cartoon maker as a real job. People thought that was a very strange profession. So when I told people I was going to work for Walt Disney, some actually wondered if I could make any money doing that. Was that really a real job? But it was, and the way Disney trained you, because there was animation, again, was a very strange profession. You really had to learn it on the job. So they would bring in a dozen or so young artists, put you through a training period of about 30 days, and then those who could adapt to the process were kept on as full-time employees. Luckily, everybody in my class made it, and we were given the title of apprentice in-betweener, which was the lowest job on the animation, the animation hierarchy. When you started at Disney as an animator, you started at the bottom, and apprentice in-betweener was the very bottom.
So what was your job as an apprentice in-betweener then?
We would do the fill-in drawings in an animation scene, and that's what the in-betweener does. Of course, I think most people know today that an animated scene is comprised of several drawings, sometimes amounting to 25 to maybe even 100 sketches. Well, those key poses have to be bridged by drawings in between. And so you would have to take the animator's extremes, those key poses, and then fill in the action in between those key drawings. And that's what the in-betweener does. Now, we're guided by a chart that the animator gives us in his scene, but it's a rather tedious, rather mundane kind of work. It wasn't for a lot of people, and after doing that for a few months, a lot of people moved on because they found the job deadly dull, and they just simply did not want to do it. But those who hung in there and kept doing it, then you had the opportunity to move up the ladder and go from being an in-betweener to a breakdown artist, and from a breakdown artist to an assistant animator, and then finally, if you were good enough, to be an animator.
So how did you feel about being attached to a Disney animated short? Were you excited? Were you nervous? What was going through your head once you were given this role?
Well, it was a very exciting time, I think, not just for myself, but probably for all of us who wanted a job in this rather crazy business. It was just great, number one, to have a job. It was great, number two, to have a job at the Walt Disney Studio, which was considered by many to be the premier animation studio in the world. And just being at Disney at that time was just very, very exciting. So I can't tell you how elated we were just to be inside the animation building, just to be able to work alongside the animation masters, many of whom had, in a way, created this marvelous business. So for me and for my colleagues, it was a very exciting time. And even though we were young artists and we were just getting our feet wet, it was just, to me, it was just one of the greatest times of my life and the start of my career. And it was just exciting to be there. And of course, Walt Disney was there at the time too. So here, the old maestro was still around, walking the hallways.
Must have been really exciting. So who was the first cartoon character that you served as an apprentice in-betweener for?
Well, I still remember that as though it were yesterday, even though that was all the way back in 1956. The first character I worked on was Jiminy Cricket. Now, people often ask me, oh, you worked on Pinocchio. I said, no, 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 no. Pinocchio was done decades earlier. The Jiminy Cricket I was working on was for the Mickey Mouse Club, which was a television show, a daily TV show that Walt Disney was doing that featured the Mouseketeers and other short films, as well as animation. So we had an assignment to do an opening song for a series of Jiminy Cricket films called I'm No Fool and The Encyclopedia, and things like that were educational in nature. So Jiminy Cricket was the first character that I worked on in an animated scene. That was really my first step into the professional arena.
So, did you feel nervous at all? I mean, you were doing in-betweens for an animated character, an iconic animated character that would be seen around the whole nation. I would be terrified if I was in that position at that age.
Well, I think in a way, as a young artist, you are concerned, but I was never terrified. And a good deal of that I owe to the wonderful artists that I had the opportunity to work with because they were very supportive. They were very encouraging. And so, yeah, they could have been a lot tougher and maybe uh, I think they knew we were young, we were just getting started, so they were very patient with us, and I'm grateful for that because they made our entry into the animation business a pleasant one. So even though the standards were high and they demanded our very best work, I never felt intimidated and I never felt unwelcome. I felt I had a good deal of encouragement, and they showed a good deal of patience, and they really made the job very pleasant. So I'm grateful for that.
So you felt confident during the process of animating Jimmy.
Yes, indeed, yeah, and that's because my bosses made it so.
So it was thanks to the people that ran the studio. So what was your first impression of the atmosphere in the great Disney studio?
The atmosphere at the Walt Disney Studio back in the 1950s was very exciting, very invigorating, one might say, because there was so much going on. Not only was Walt Disney making an animated feature film at the time, Sleeping Beauty, they were also doing animated shorts, Donald Duck shorts and Chip and Dale and a number of other things. They were also just getting started into television. So we had the Disneyland show on ABC television, which was a weekly show. We had the Mickey Mouse Club, that was a daily show, and that was on television. Outside on the sound stages, Walt was producing a series of live action feature films. So we had that going. And of course, with all that activity, with television, motion pictures, magazines, recording, it was just a hotbed of entertainment and excitement. And you felt like you were in the company of great artists, great craftsmen. It was just a very exciting place to be.
So did you have the time and freedom to go and explore the studio?
Oh, I did indeed. I did indeed. Part of working at Disney, part of what made our job so much fun, was that we had the opportunity to explore the entire Disney studio lot. And that meant you were free to wander about and visit the sound stages where they might be shooting a motion picture. Go back into the machine shop where they might be building attractions for the theme park down in Anaheim. Uh, Go into the back lot where they might be shooting a western on a western street. You know, the old American West was still very much there in Burbank, California. So it was just a very exciting place to be, and for a young kid just getting his start in the business, as I call it in my book, it was like Alice visiting Wonderland. It was just a magical place.
So did the atmosphere inspire you and encourage you during the working process then?
Oh, it did indeed. I think what I found about Disney was that it was inspirational. Walt Disney himself was a leader who inspired his workers to do their finest work. So yeah, I think I found my job to be not just one of hard work, because it was hard work, but it was also inspiring. And you actually look forward to coming to work each day because that's how it felt. You felt lucky to be there. You felt lucky to be a part of something so great, and that millions of people were going to enjoy. So it was a very exciting time.
Definitely sounds magical.
It does. It does indeed.
So after you animated Jiminy Cricket, what kind of other projects were you assigned to afterwards?
Oh, there were many. As I said before, there were so many projects moving through the studio. Um, and because we were young artists, and because we were kind of like, you know, we were put on various projects. We would go wherever we were needed. So our jobs would vary. You might work on a segment of the Disneyland show. And since a number of shows were in production, it could be any number of programs that involved maybe different animals. I remember working on a show called The Great Cat Family. And that, we had to draw various cats because I think the story was kind of like a history of the felines. And so I worked on other shows that involved Donald Duck was in a number of Disneyland shows. So we worked on the duck. And even a sequence from Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. Now, I know that might sound odd, but that film had long since been completed by the time I got to Disney. But Walt Disney wanted to show a sequence from the film that had not been seen by audiences because this particular sequence was cut from the film. Well, Walt wanted to show it on the Disneyland program, and so he pulled it out of the morgue, which was our old research library where we stored all the old drawings and all the scenes, especially scenes not used in the film. And we pulled out this material and cleaned it up because Walt wanted to show it on the Disneyland program. So I even worked on the Seven Dwarfs. So my assignments were many and varied, and I did lots of different things.
So was it exciting to have something completely random every time you would enter the studio?
It was indeed. It was indeed. Working on the same thing day after day can get a bit tedious. So the fact that our work tended to vary from, from a Donald Duck to a Mickey Mouse to a Seven Dwarfs, there was always something new and different, and that's what made the job exciting because it was always things were always changing, and you never knew what was coming next.
So, were there any particular kinds of projects or tasks that you look forward to doing the most?
Well, I don't know if I had any favorites because, keep in mind that all this material is all Disney material, so I kind of loved all of it. And each character, each scene had its own special, touch, and so it's difficult to choose a favorite. I mean, I think I enjoyed working on everything that came my way. There were things that were more difficult than others. Work on the Disney feature films tended to be a good deal more different from the work on the Disney short films because the shorts were more cartoony, more loose and expressive, where work on a feature film tended to be more demanding. The animators were extremely fussy about your drawing ability, and they wanted nothing but your very best. So in that sense, working on shorts tended to be a little bit easier from the rigors of being given a feature film assignment.
So you preferred doing shorts to features, would you say?
I think overall I did because I'm more of a cartoonist and it was just more fun to work on shorts. Not that I didn't enjoy feature work because even though it had special demands, and in a way I think I probably worked a good deal harder on the features, but it was good training. It was a good discipline, and I needed that as a young artist. I think we all did. So it was enjoyable in its own way.
I see. So did you have any creative freedom? I know that you were just an apprentice in between, but during any process were you given the chance to pitch your own ideas?
Well, the way it goes at Disney, it is a long apprenticeship, and because we were the bottom of the barrel, you might say, because we were apprentice in-betweeners, we didn't have creative freedom at all. We were basically there to serve the process. I mean, we were assistants there to do our part in getting the job done. Now, of course, after you've been at Disney a good deal longer and you had proven yourself and you had developed yourself as a professional, then there were more creative opportunities. We had some chaps who wanted to get into the background department because they wanted to become background painters. They too had to serve an apprenticeship in animation doing in-betweens, which probably for them was probably just a ghastly assignment and probably pretty dull and tedious when they were looking forward to working with paints and brushes and color. This job doing in-betweens must have been, quite a chore. But eventually, they made their way up and got to the position they wanted. Others wanted to do layout. Others wanted to become writers and do story work. That was where my path was leading, to the story department, although I didn't know it at the time.
So what was your relationship like with other apprentices in the studio? Like, did you spend time with them outside the studio? Did you get along with them inside the studio?
Oh, we did indeed, because keep in mind, we were all like-minded individuals. I mean, we were all artists, and we were all artists who loved animation. So we were kind of like our own little private club. We were maybe regarded as somewhat odd by the rest of society, but we certainly got along very well amongst ourselves. And many of us would socialize outside the studio. We would go to movies, we would go to parties, and we got along just fine. So, and we were all around the same age anyway. I mean, we were all just, kids just getting our start in the business. We certainly did not socialize with our bosses, who were generally older and more experienced. Our bosses were more the age of our parents, so we didn't really socialize with them. But we got along just great, and there was a real kinship between animation artists, both male and female, because there were young women as well as young men, and we got along just fine.
So did this friendship carry on after you guys were promoted and got to the places you want to be?
Oh, yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. It carried on for years. Many of my friends and pals who, in time, got married, were raising a family, even if they had left the studio, and many did leave Disney to go on to other opportunities. We still kept in touch. And even today, I'm still good friends with many of the children of my colleagues and my friends. I know their children. I watch their children grow up. And so we've always remained close. And I think that's special. I think that's something very special.
Yeah, it does sound very touching, actually, yeah.
It does, yeah, it does.
Okay, I'd like to talk about the feature films that you got involved with, things like Sleeping Beauty, Sword in the Stone, Jungle Book, and Robin Hood.
Yes.
So what kind of responsibilities did you have on the earlier films, like Sleeping Beauty, Sword in the Stone, that era? What were your main jobs during those films, and were there any specific scenes that you remember working on?
Well, I worked on a lot of... I worked in animation the early part of my career, so I was down in the animation department, and I thought that's where I would stay, because my goal was to become an animator. Anyway, that was my goal, and so I knew I had to serve this apprenticeship in order to finally, get to that place where I might be given the opportunity to animate. So as I began to move up the ladder from in-betweener to breakdown artist, which was, a bit of a promotion, to assistant animator, which was a even bigger promotion, I had the opportunity to work on the Sword in the Stone after Sleeping Beauty. Oh, I should mention 101 Dalmatians. Very important picture, because that was kind of a landmark picture for us, because it ushered in new technology. So that was a very important film. But I was working as an assistant on the 101 Dalmatians, on Sword in the Stone, and on Mary Poppins. And that was great. I truly enjoyed myself, and I had a great time, and I learned a good deal because I worked with so many good artists. Milt Kahl on Sword in the Stone, and Art Stevens and Julia Svensson on the 101 Dalmatians. So many. I could go on listing names, because a lot of people who know their Disney history would know these famous names. But I worked with so many good people,
So what did the job of assistant animator involve doing then on these feature films?
Well, the job of the assistant was you would receive your scene from the animator. And animators, as you know, work very rough, rough sketches as they sketch out the animation in the scene. Our job as assistants was to take those scenes and clean them up. That is, to take the rough drawings and finalize them into a more comprehensive finish line drawing. And then we would pass those sketches down to our assistants, who would then do the in-betweens, as we once did when we were young artists just starting out. So being an assistant animator, you worked more closely with the animator. And of course, that gave you the opportunity to really get to know these old guys and to see their work techniques. And a lot of that I describe in my book, because you have the opportunity to work with these Disney masters, and it's just really very special. Again, guys like Frank Thomas and Ollie Johnson, Eric Larson, John Lounsbury, Milt Kahl, Ward Kimball, names who are legendary today, but here you're working closely with these guys and learning from them. So for a young artist, that was a real special opportunity.
Wow. So so I've noticed that a lot of Disney features, particularly in the era that you worked in, they had more than one director. Was that ever complicating for you? Because did you have too many creative decisions going your way?
No, not really, because it's true that Walt Disney tended to have three directors on a film. Somehow Walt, I don't know if this was ever the plan, but animation, because it is such a tedious process, was often too demanding for one director. So what Walt would do is take a motion picture and divide it up into essentially three sections, and each section would be given to a different director. So one director might start the film, and he would handle all of the earlier parts, say the first act might be handled by one director. Another director would handle Act 2, and he and his team would work on that part of the film. And then the film might be wrapped up by a third director who would handle that section. So in one sense, even though you've got three creative minds, there wasn't that much of a clash. They all worked together, and things would come together. But because keep in mind, the overall director, when you get right down to it, the overall director was Walt Disney. It was Walt who pulled all this together and made the film work as a whole. So I never experienced any creative clashes because of having three directors on a film. Everything always worked rather smoothly, as it had been for decades before I had even arrived at Disney.
Now, speaking of Walt Disney, what was your relationship like with him, and what was it like meeting him for the first time?
Well, I have to remind people that my relationship with Walt Disney was hardly a close one. And keep in mind that Walt Disney was an older gentleman, probably in his 50s when I arrived at the studio, and in his 60s, by the time I came around to working with him. So I have to remind people that my relationship with Walt was was hardly one of a pal. I was just a kid who was lucky enough to be in the same room with Walt Disney, lucky enough to hear his advice and be given notes. But we certainly never went out for coffee together. We certainly never sat and had a cigarette together. I was just a kid in my 20s, and Walt was an older gentleman, as I said, more the age of my parents. So it was definitely not that kind of a relationship. However, I did have the opportunity to be in the same room with him and take notes from him and absorb everything I could from the old maestro. So that's about as close as I came. And as I said, I often tell people, Walt never even called me by name. He usually addressed me as kid. And that, and after all, that seemed to fit because I was a kid. So that was as close as I ever got to Walt Disney.
Well, people have compared him to being like family. So did you ever see him as like an uncle figure by any chance, or were you not that close?
Oh, yes. I think most people saw Walt Disney as kind of as an uncle figure. He was that kind of a gentleman. Once again, when I tell people I don't have anything bad to say about Walt because he was always very good to us. And even when he was stern, you might say he was more like a stern parent. At least that's how I viewed him from my youthful point of view. But no, he was very much, in a way, a father figure to many at his studio. He was the man we looked up to. He was the one who made the final decision, and he was the man we had to please. In every case, we had to please Walt. So yeah, he was very much a great uncle or a father figure, and a man we respected a great deal.
So, what name did you address him? Did you call him Uncle Walt, Mr. Disney?
He didn't like being called Mr. Disney. He insisted on being addressed as Walt. So whenever we had a question, whenever we had something to say, it was always Walt, because Walt, for some reason, wanted the studio to be on a first name basis. So everybody called everybody by their first names. At first, this was a bit awkward for me because I was raised by my parents to address older people by Mr. or Mrs. So it was somewhat awkward to call Mr. Call Milt Call, call him Milt, or call Mr. Thomas Frank. It took a while to get used to that, and it certainly took a while to call Walt Disney Walt when your inclination was to say Mr. Disney. But he didn't want to hear Mr. Disney, so we called him Walt.
So, what was Walt's role on a production that he was involved with, and like how involved did he get in it, and how much did he contribute during production?
Oh, a good deal, a good deal. That's what made the Walt Disney Studio unique, because when you work for Walt Disney Productions, as it was called back then, you worked for Walt Disney, and he was very involved. Walt Disney was involved in everything. It's difficult to explain today where bosses of companies, chief executive officers, tend to be in an ivory tower. They tend to be almost unseen and untouchable. With Walt Disney, he was everywhere. He was everywhere, not only in story meetings, but he was walking around the lot. He would be back in the machine shop, in the carpentry shop, on the sound stages. He would be asking the gardeners why they were planting a particular kind of plant on the studio lot, or what kind of flowers were those in the flower bed. Walt Disney was a man totally hands-on, totally in touch. He was involved with everything.
Now, you've mentioned that he was a bit like a director, yet he was never credited as a director, he was credited as a producer. So I was wondering, how come he never addressed himself as a director?
Yeah, that's interesting. Walt Disney never took a director's credit. To the best of my knowledge, he seldom took a producer's credit. I think the way Walt saw his company was that the Walt Disney Studio was his studio, and that ultimately anything that came out of Disney was the product of Walt Disney, be it a ride at his theme park at Disneyland, be it a book, a movie, or song. That was all Disney. So I think Walt felt no need to take a director's credit or a credit of any kind. I think the only credit that mattered was that first name you saw on the screen when it said Walt Disney Presents. That really meant what it said. When somebody came up and said Walt Disney Presents, it was indeed presented by Walt Disney. And that meant it had his touch, it had his approval, it had his final okay. So it was very much a Walt Disney production.
So what was the difference between Walt's contribution and the director's contribution?
Well, everything at the Walt Disney Studio was a collaborative effort. So even though we had great directors who contributed to every motion picture, they were indeed directors. But keep in mind, even with that, Walt Disney still had the final say. No matter what it was, the final word came from Walt. When a director approved a sequence in a motion picture, and directors would look at our sequences when we storyboarded and give his approval, that approval by the director alone wasn't enough. It had to eventually be approved by Walt Disney. And until it was not going in the movie. And that was the same with everything, from a song to a storybook. It had to first be approved by Walt. a theme park attraction had to be approved by Walt Disney. It may have been approved by the designers. It may have been approved by the engineers, but it wasn't approved until Walt Disney had approved it. And that's pretty much the way everything worked at Walt Disney Productions.
Okay, and how do you feel about Walt Disney's fame? I mean, he's become a household name, which he obviously deserves, but how do the artists working for his company feel about him being granted a higher recognition? I mean, even to this day, names like Milt Kahl or Wolfgang Reeferman are far less recognized by the public in comparison to Disney.
Well, I think Walt Disney made that clear to his employees. Once you decided to come to work for Walt Disney, you were not there to build your career or build your own name. You weren't there to enhance your reputation. You were there to serve the Walt Disney Company. And if you weren't happy with that, if that didn't satisfy you, then Walt's advice was, then no hard feelings, but you'd best move on. You weren't there to become a famous person. If any name was going to become famous, it would be Walt Disney. And if your name happened to be known by fans or historians or Disney aficionados, that was fine. That was all well and good, but that was almost a byproduct. One of the artists, Ward Kimball, had quite a reputation outside of Disney, mainly because Ward was such a creative guy and he had his own band, Firehouse 5+2. And so a lot of people knew the name Ward Kimball. They knew that Ward Kimball worked for Walt Disney. Now, that was okay as long as Kimball didn't push it too far. And the artists really had to be very careful. In a sense, they sort of had to manage their own fame. You wouldn't want to become too famous at the Walt Disney Studio because that probably wouldn't serve you well. So artists had best keep their ego in check because nobody was going to usurp Walt Disney. His name was the name that mattered, and it was going to stay that way as long as he was around.
Do you think that was a fair process?
I think it was fair. I think I think those were the terms, and I think when one signed on to work for Disney, you knew what the terms were. And if you weren't happy with those terms, then you would best seek employment elsewhere. But if you were willing to be part of the Disney family, risk becoming an unknown artist or being, somewhat submerged in the Disney organization, if that didn't bother you, then, you were happy to have a great job, a pretty good paycheck, and some nice perks to go along with it. But if that didn't set well with you, and with some artists it didn't, and they wanted to move on, and that's all well and good. But I think we all knew the terms when we signed on, and this was the Disney studio, not yours. It would be Walt's ideas that mattered, not necessarily yours. And if you were okay with that, then Walt was okay with that. So that's simply the way it worked at Disney, at least during Walt Disney's lifetime.
I've always been fascinated about that personally, and seeing how that works and how the people there feel about it.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
I've also noticed on IMDb that you received no credit for a lot of the early Disney features. Is it correct?
Yes, that's correct, and that was not unusual. Credits are not like back then. You have to realize screen credits were not like they are today. Today, you go to the cinema and the movie ends and the credits roll, and sometimes those credits go on for 8 to 10 minutes because there are so many of them. But back in the old days, not everybody received a screen credit, nor did you expect to receive one. And so I knew that when I did work on a number of films, there would be no screen credit. I knew that the animators would receive credit, and that was well and good, but the animators' assistants or their assistants would not receive a screen credit. And things went on that way for a number of years. Now today, of course, it's totally changed. And today, everybody receives a screen credit. drivers, the caterer, the accountants, sometimes even the pets of the artists will receive a screen credit. I've seen credits that involved the company cat or the company dog get a credit on the film. So it's a different world today. But back when I was a kid, not everybody received a screen credit, and I didn't even receive my first credit on a Disney film until the 90s. And I believe my first credit on a Disney film was The Hunchback of Notre Dame. And that was the first time I'd ever received a screen credit, even though I had worked on dozens of Disney films.
So how did you feel about not receiving credit?
Well, it's something that I've dealt with. I would have liked to have received the credit on The Jungle Book, because that was a very special film for me. It was my first film as a story artist, and it was a very special time, and I had the opportunity to work with Walt Disney on that film. And if there's any film I would have loved to have had a screen credit on, it would have been The Jungle Book. But that's not the way things were back in the 1960s. And again, it's not just me. My colleagues who worked in story, Al Wilson, one of our story artists who did wonderful work on that film, did not receive a credit, nor did a few of the other guys, like Al Wilson, Dick Lucas, Eric Cleworth. Matter of fact, the one story artist who did receive a credit on the film was Vance Gary. So out of the story team, the storyboard artists, only Vance Gary received a story credit, along with Ken Anderson and Ralph Wright, who actually received a credit on The Jungle Book. But, you just have to move on. That's just the way things were back then. And not everybody was guaranteed a credit on a film, and so that's just the way it was.
No, I personally would have found that to be very hard to deal with personally, but it's interesting how it was so different back then.
Yeah, it was just the times. Things were different back then.
Would you say that's because of the way that things were in the 50s? Would you say it was easier to deal with because of the atmosphere of the 50s?
Oh, well, keep in mind, things had been this way in motion pictures in general for many, many years. Feature films were no different. Generally, the credits on a feature film, a live-action film, credits were given to the department heads. So therefore, even though an art director might have maybe half a dozen people working with him on a feature film, only he or she would receive credit on the film because they were the head of the department. Not everybody was guaranteed a screen credit. So this kind of thing went on throughout motion pictures in general, not just Disney, but MGM, Warner Brothers, Fox, other studios didn't give everyone who worked on a film a screen credit. All of that didn't come until much, much later.
So I'd now like to talk about Walt Disney's death.
Yes.
How did you find out about it?
Well, I didn't receive the news until Friday afternoon, back in December of 1966. Of course, I knew that Walt was not in the best of health. I knew that he had been quite ill. But what was encouraging was that after Walt's surgery, he had actually come back to work. Now, that was encouraging because Walt had had this bout with lung cancer. Not surprising because he had been a smoker all of his life. So he had this bout with lung cancer and had been in the hospital for surgery. Now, the prognosis was it was a positive one, and we thought, good, the cancer has been removed. The boss has come back to work. We thought that things were looking up. So I remember talking to one of the guards at the studio gate on the Thursday afternoon. I was concerned because Walt Disney had gone back into the hospital. The hospital, by the way, was right across the street. St. Joseph's Hospital was literally across the street from the Walt Disney Studio. So you could simply walk out of the gate of Disney and into the gate of the hospital right next door. Well, I had gotten news that Walt Disney had returned to the hospital, but the guard at the gate said, "Oh, it's nothing to worry about. We think that Walt has just gone back over to the hospital for a checkup. The doctors want to see how he's progressing. Well, we didn't know how bad it was because sadly the very next day, Walt Disney had passed away, although the news was not announced to the press or to the studio until Friday afternoon. But those close to Mr. Disney, family members, and his brother, Roy in particular, knew how bad it was. And Roy Disney, as a very sweet gesture, had the studio personnel leave all the lights on at the Walt Disney Studio. He wanted all the lights left on Thursday evening because he knew that Walt Disney could look out of his hospital window, cross the street to the studio, and see all the lights at the Disney Studio to, in a sense, let him know that the studio was still there, everything was still going on, and that so he could rest at ease that Walt Disney Productions was in good hands. So I always thought that was a very kind gesture that Roy Disney would order all the lights be left on at the studio so his brother could look out of his hospital window and see the Disney studio, in a sense, glowing that night before Walt would eventually, in a few hours, leave us. He would pass on Friday morning.
So how did you feel about his death?
I think, like many, I think a feeling of shock. We were, in a sense, devastated, and yet it's surprising because we knew how ill he was. We really shouldn't have been surprised about his sudden passing because we knew that he was quite ill. I think there was a feeling of denial among most of us. We could not bear the thought of losing Walt Disney. So we sort of, in a sense, thought, well, Walt Disney cannot die. We need him too much. The company needs him. The world needs him. He can't die. And yet he's a mortal man. Of course he can die. But we just didn't want to accept this. So it was devastating. And I think it literally took the Walt Disney Company a good 10 years before we got past Walt's death. It was that devastating to the studio that it took us nearly 10 years to recover.
So what was the atmosphere like once you returned back to the studio after his death?
Well, keep in mind, but I had already decided to move on. And so I did not return to the Disney studio after Walt's passing, except as a visitor. And I did visit quite often because I felt like the Disney studio was a second home for me. So I was a visitor there quite often, but I didn't return to the studio until a good 5 or 6 years later when I came back to help out a little bit on a movie called Bedknobs and Broomsticks. And that was probably in the early 70s. And I had since left Disney and I'd been working on my own outside of the studio. But I was asked to come back and help them on a feature film that starred Angela Lansbury, I believe David Tomlinson. A lot of our people from Mary Poppins came back together on that film, and so in a way, it was kind of a homecoming. The Sherman Brothers were back writing the music. Ward Kimball handled the animation sequence. Before it had been directed by Ham Lusk, but this time Ward Kimball came on as animation director. But in many ways, it was kind of like a reunion, and it was a really fun film to work on. It did not have the success of Mary Poppins, I must say, and even though we had so much of the original talent back, the film just did not resonate with audiences, and I've often wondered why. And I think the reason why was we didn't have Walt Disney to pull it all together. And that's why Bedknobs and Broomsticks never had the success that Mary Poppins had.
By any chance, are you aware of what the creative process was like after Walt's death and how much of his legacy would affect creative decisions in future projects?
Well, I think our creative process hadn't changed at all after Walt's passing. We still made films the same way. Films were still written and directed, and all aspects of production were still handled the same way as they had been years earlier. The one thing that we didn't have, of course, was the input from the old maestro himself, Walt Disney. That was the one thing we lacked, and apparently that one ingredient was critical for a lot of our success, or I should say lack of success. And so the studio really floundered for nearly 10 years trying to carry on without Walt Disney. But without Walt there to guide us, we really did struggle, I think. I think the company did struggle for a number of years before it finally found its footing. But that wasn't until the early 80s, under new management led by Frank Wells and Michael Eisner.
Now, after you left Disney, you started working at Hanna-Barbera.
Yes, I did. I did work there for a time.
So what made you decide to go from Disney to Hanna-Barbera?
Well, I think circumstances. It wasn't really a conscious choice. When I left Disney, it was to launch my own production company where we did, I should say, a series of educational films. And I must admit, I enjoyed that a good deal because it was the opportunity to leave a big studio and work in a much smaller studio. So it was a major shift in my life and in my career. I enjoyed it because in a smaller studio, you get to wear many hats. You do many jobs, and I think that's what makes the smaller company more exciting. I was sometimes producer. I was sometimes a director. I was sometimes a writer and sometimes an animator. Sometimes I was a delivery boy. You know, I did everything, and that's what made that job so exciting. Well, sadly, there was a downturn in the educational market, and the work began to be not as plentiful. And so in order to earn a living, I had to go back into mainstream animation just to earn a paycheck. A studio that needed help at the time was Hanna-Barbera. So even though it wasn't Disney by any means, it was still cartoon making and something I still enjoyed doing. So I signed on at Hanna-Barbera and stayed there for nearly 7 years, I think, doing various television shows such as Scooby Doo, the Flintstones, the Smurfs, and many shows whose names I can't even remember at this time.
So, am I right in saying that that Hanna-Barbera cartoons were a lot cheaper than Disney efforts?
Oh, much cheaper, much cheaper. Yeah, almost no comparison when it comes down to budget. Producing films for the theaters and producing films for television, it's almost night and day in terms of scheduling, in terms of money. We had to work a lot faster. We had to work a lot cheaper. That's just it was the nature of the beast. So comparing Walt Disney to Hanna-Barbera was like night and day. It was a totally different animal altogether, but one you adjust to. And not everybody can make that adjustment. There were some people who came to Hanna-Barbera from Disney and just could not adjust to that work schedule at all. With me, I knew I had to be flexible. I knew I had to do a good deal more in a lot less time for a lot less money. So I made that adjustment. And so I had a good time doing Saturday morning cartoons. It was a lot of fun. Certainly could not be compared to Disney. Certainly not the quality of Disney by any means. But we had fun doing it. And I did that for about 7 or so years before I eventually returned to Disney in the 1980s as a writer.
So did the budget of Hanna-Barbera cartoons limit or hinder your creative freedom?
Well, it allows you to be creative in a different way. I often tell people, I think creativity is never really hindered by budget. I mean, certainly you cannot make a film that would compare to a Disney feature film with such a limited budget. But knowing that, you learn to work in another way. You know what you can and what you cannot do. So at Hanna-Barbera, knowing that you're making cartoons for Saturday morning, in no way could that compare with doing 101 Dalmatians, for example. But that doesn't mean you cannot be creative within those limitations. So you learn to work within that budget, and you learn to work within that time schedule, and you learn to make the best product you can, under those circumstances. So creativity is never limited. It has to be adjusted, of course, because you cannot do Sleeping Beauty on a Hanna-Barbera budget. But you can still turn out a decent program that entertains people. And that was my job, was to create entertainment, if only on a lower level, you might say.
Did you ever have to do any looping of the animation because of the limited budget?
The reuse, oh yes, we did quite a bit of that. Whenever possible, because once again, we're talking about time constraints and budget constraints. And so the producers are always looking for ways to save money or to make a dollar go further. So yes, we did do quite a bit of reuse. Hopefully, it wasn't too obvious, but it's the nature of the business, and you do what you have to. And so you make that adjustment. Years later, when I returned to Disney, I was back with a much larger budget and a good deal more time. So you adjust back to that, because now you're working on a Disney level, on a Disney standard. And so you can do a good deal more, mainly because you have more time and you have more money. It's always about time and money in this business anyway. That's what the motion picture field is all about. It's about time and it's about money.
So were there any other kind of tricks or methods that you had to use at Hanna-Barbera to get away with some things?
Well, number one is you learn to work faster. You learn to work a whole lot faster. Say at Walt Disney, if I was working on a story, I would sometimes have a year to develop a story for an animated feature motion picture. A whole year. That gives you a good deal of creative freedom and flexibility, because you've got a good deal of time and money to work with. When I was working at Hanna-Barbera, I would sometimes write a script over a weekend. Over a weekend. That's a couple of days. That's a big difference from having a year to develop a story. So you adjust based on the kind of product you're doing. It's great to have the luxury of a year to develop a story. But sometimes it's a challenge to have to write a story over a weekend, and you learn to adjust to that, and you do what you can within those limitations. So I find both ways of working very exciting. I don't look at doing Saturday morning television, or any TV show for that matter. I'm working on a show right now that has a limited budget, and of course we have to work a lot, a good deal faster. But that's just the nature of the medium. In television, you work faster. In motion pictures, you get a good deal more time.
So what was the Hanna-Barbera studio like? What was the atmosphere like? And what were the people there like?
It was a fun atmosphere, a very enjoyable atmosphere. I look back on those years as a very enjoyable time. Even though I was no longer at Disney, it didn't mean that I enjoyed my work any less. In some ways, I think I had more fun because the atmosphere was a good deal looser and more collegial. I don't know. It was like being back in school. It was like going back to high school because I worked with a lot of young men and women, and we had a lot of fun. By that time, I was older, so I had a lot of young people who were being trained under me. So now I was kind of the old industry veteran, training young kids and inviting them into this crazy business and passing on what I'd learned to them. Many of them would go on to become writers and directors in their own right. So it was a very exciting time, and it was good to be making that move from being the young kid, the novice coming into the business, and now going from novice to veteran and training other young people. So I enjoyed that very much, and Even though our shows could hardly be called stellar, most of them were just awful, I would say. Some were passable, some were just awful. But I enjoyed it. I enjoyed the process. I enjoyed working with the two gentlemen, Bill Hanna and Joe Barbera, who I referred to as Mr. Hanna and Mr. Barbera. Uh, Even though it was a very kind of a crazy studio, there was a formality when it came to dealing with the bosses. So I always addressed Bill Hanna as Mr. Hanna, and I addressed Joe Barbera as Mr. Barbera. But I enjoyed working for them, and only have good things to say about them. Even though I did have fun with them by drawing cartoons about them all the time, it didn't mean I didn't like them. I actually liked them both a good deal. I just loved to poke fun at them because that's what a cartoonist does.
Mm-hmm. So, what was your
Yeah.
relationship like with them? Like, what were they like in person, and how would you compare them to Walt?
Different,
Yes.
different. I mean, of course, it's difficult to compare anyone to Walt. Joe and Bill were creative guys, much like Walt Disney. Their style was different. The way they worked was totally different. They had spent years over at MGM, Metro Goldwyn Mayer, running the animation division, doing the Tom and Jerry's, and they had done that for years. Joe Barbera was a talented story man and a great pitchman. He was very good at selling ideas. Bill Hanna was a nuts and bolts kind of guy whose skill was in getting a picture done and getting it done on time and on schedule. He also had an interest in music, and believe it or not, a lot of people don't know this. He was a songwriter and wrote a lot of those clever jingles that accompany the Hanna-Barbera cartoons. He probably even wrote that Flintstone song, Flintstones, Meet the Flintstones. Well, that was the kind of thing that Bill did, and he made a good deal of money as a songwriter, as well as being an animation producer. I'll bet a lot of people don't know that about Mr. Hanna, that he wrote a number of those clever and funny songs that either began or ended those H&B shows. But they were fun to work with. I had no problem well, we had problems on occasion. That's just the nature of the business. Even had a few fights. Got into a fight with Mr. Hanna one day and walked out of the studio. I just quit and walked out. But a few days later, we met. We had lunch in Hollywood, and we ironed out our differences. And I came back to work. So even though we had our occasional spats, we always made up, and we parted the best of friends. So I have only good things to say about Bill Hanna and Joe Barbera. It was a great place to work, and I enjoyed my time there, even though I eventually returned to Disney.
So, how involved were Joe and William during the process of making a cartoon at their studio?
Oh, they were involved every day. Keep in mind that these guys came to work every day. I mean, they had offices in the building, and like most good managers, they did not stay in those offices, but they made the rounds to see how production was going. Bill Hanna especially was a hands-on producer. Bill Hanna would walk around his studio, just seeing how the production was going, the animation department, the layout department, the ink and paint department, the editors editing the film downstairs, the camera department. This was a totally in-house operation when I started there. Everything was done right here in Hollywood, from the writing to the animation to the ink and paint to the shooting. Everything was done on the Hanna-Barbera studio lot. So Bill Hanna was very much a hands-on boss. I remember sitting down at a table and going over storyboards with Mr. Hanna as he would decide what to keep in or what to cut from the film. Sitting there working one-on-one with the boss. So I felt I had a very close relationship with Bill Hanna. A little less so with Joe Barbera, because Joe's job was mainly to pitch new ideas. So he usually worked with the guys in development, developing shows for the upcoming season. I did a bit of that on occasion, but mainly I worked in production. But Bill and Joe were both very, very much hands-on managers, and were very I mean, the artists can't say that their bosses were aloof and out of touch because both of those guys were very much in touch with everything going on in the studio.
Okay, so they were heavily involved with their cartoons, but were they proud of the series that they ran? I mean, did they want their cartoons to impress the public, or did they see their shows as just business products?
Yeah, it's hard to say. That's a very good question, and I really wonder how they felt about it. I think they took a good deal of pride in their earlier work, where they worked at MGM, and they won a number of Oscars for their Tom and Jerry cartoons. Looking back on that, they probably feel like that was their best work. Now, this is not to say they were ashamed of the work they did for Saturday morning television, because some of the shows they produced are still memorable today. People still talk about how much they love the Flintstones or Huckleberry Hound. This is decades later. People still remember their childhood fondly, watching Saturday morning cartoons and watching Scooby Doo and watching the Flintstones and so many shows, the names I can't even remember today. So I think Bill and Joe took a degree of pride in what they had created. Although I think in time it began to be more of a job, just a commercial process. They had to get the work done. How much they loved it and how much they thought they were doing stellar work, I don't know. I guess you would have to ask them that. But they were involved, so it meant that their heart was still in it, because I think if they had been disconnected, they would not have been making the rounds, around the studio and checking to see how things were going on.
So would you say that they had a noticeable passion in what they were talking about when they confronted you in the studio?
Oh, I think they did, very much so. And I think they recognized that, once again, their name was on the product. When the credits came up and it said a Hanna-Barbera production, well, you can't help but be invested in that. If your name's on the show, you're going to have concern about it. I know I would if my name was on a motion picture or a TV show. I would certainly want that show to be, to represent me in a positive way. So I think they gave a good deal of thought to the product that was being produced at their studio.
No, I've always been curious about those too. So you've also worked at Pixar as well.
Yes, yes. In the late '90s, I'd always admired the work Pixar was doing. I had been a kind of a Pixar fan for a number of years before they even became a movie company. I saw them initially as a software company, and I purchased their software to use while working for Disney. In time, a group of us at the Disney studio would invite some of the artists and the technologists to come down to Disney and speak with us because, I don't know, we had this kind of a kinship. What I didn't realize was that the Disney studio management also had an involvement with Pixar. They were having Pixar write for them the computer paint system that we eventually used in our feature film. I wasn't even aware this was going on initially until it was brought to my attention. But Pixar developed the software for Walt Disney's CAPS system. And CAPS was our computer paint system that was used on films from Beauty and the Beast on up forward to, I don't know, used on several films. But we went from painting sheets of acetate by hand to painting these films on the computer. Well, that initial software was developed by Pixar. But then, lo and behold, by around 1994, Pixar began working on a feature film. Once again, I wasn't aware of this until one morning I stopped in one of our buildings in Glendale, and I saw a film being projected in the editorial bay. And it didn't look like anything we were working on. And what surprised me was how good the film was, how entertaining the film was, and yet I didn't recognize it as anything we were doing. Well, it turns out what I was looking at was the film Toy Story as it was being developed by Pixar. So, what a surprise. Well, eventually, by 1995, the film was completed and released and turned out to be a big hit. And Pixar was kind of like on its way as a partner with the Walt Disney Company producing feature animated films, only doing the whole thing digitally. So it was a landmark film. It was a landmark in animation for Pixar to produce the first digitally animated feature-length cartoon.
And then you got involved with Toy Story too.
Yes, I did. Quite surprising because I never expected to. I had been approached by one of Pixar's story artists some years earlier, asking me if I would be willing to come up north and work at this little studio. I had no idea at the time what studio he was talking about, but I declined. I said no, I couldn't do it because I had just signed the contract, a 4-year contract with the Walt Disney Company to work on a series of films at Disney. So I had to back off this, a rather nice offer. Later, I found out the film they were developing was Toy Story, and I felt like kicking myself because, oh, what an opportunity I've missed. But I was lucky enough to be asked a second time because a year or so later, after Toy Story had been released, they had decided to do a sequel that would eventually be called Toy Story 2. And once again, I was invited to come up to Pixar to work on this motion picture. Well, only this time around, my Disney contract was finally up, and I was finally able to take the opportunity to move up north to the Bay Area, up near San Francisco, and work on the feature film Toy Story 2. So that was my first involvement with Pixar Animation Studios.
So what were your responsibilities within the project of Toy Story 2?
Well, they asked me to come up and develop the story. Pixar at the time was a very young studio. A lot of the people at Pixar, many of them were just out of school. So they were a fledgling organization. They had only recently become motion picture makers. Keep in mind, they'd only made one film. They had a second film in production, A Bug's Life, but only one film had been released. So the producer of the film realized they needed help, and they needed help from industry professionals, veterans, guys who had been around a while. Well, keep in mind, by this time, I was getting to be a rather old codger, and so I was regarded by some as an industry veteran and a guy who had been around for a while. So they asked if I would come up and work with the young people up at Pixar developing the storyline on Toy Story 2. And I said I would be delighted, especially since nobody else wanted to move up there anyway. I was one of the few who volunteered. I said I'd be happy to go. It meant having to leave my home down here in Pasadena and move up to the Bay Area, which I did gladly. And I had the opportunity to work with a lot of talented people over a period of about 3 years, from 1997 to 1999, on one of the finest animated films ever made, Toy Story 2.
So, what parts of the story did you contribute to, and is there anything that you did develop during pre-production that didn't end up in the film?
Oh, there was a good deal that didn't end up in the film. That's the very nature of animation story development. You start out with a lot of ideas, and it doesn't mean that these ideas are necessarily going to end up in the film at all. People ask me, what did I work on? I worked on the entire movie from start to finish, probably around 3 times. We started out, boarded the film, developing the story in early 1997. We did a complete story pass that first year, that is from January to December of 1997. In 1998, we did another complete story pass of Toy Story 2, getting the bugs worked out, trying to focus the story and pull things together. By late in the year 1998, we had a film we felt was good enough to show to Disney. And we took the film down. I remember flying down from the Bay Area to Burbank. By the way, Steve Jobs came along with us. You might remember that Steve Jobs was the owner
Yeah.
of Pixar Animation Studios. He had purchased the company from George Lucas some years earlier. Well, Steve Jobs came down with us for the screening, and we showed the film to the Disney executives. And they really liked the way things were going. They seemed overall quite pleased with the film. I thought our screening, though not perfect, was a successful showing. By January of 1999, we finally regained the full-time services of John Lasseter. John had had his hands full. He had been busy directing Bug's Life and just trying to run the studio. So, he found it difficult to spend a good deal of time with us. But by January of 1999, John was able to come onto the film full-time. And he took a look at the movie and said, it's a good movie, but it could be a great movie, and that we should start over. And so, in January of 1999, Toy Story 2 had a third complete story pass, where the entire film was once again rescripted and reboarded from start to finish. Now, the result of that was what I would call an animation masterpiece, because I think that Toy Story 2 is a solid story. And I can't say that for a lot of feature films, be they Disney or Pixar films. I think that Toy Story 2 is probably one of the best stories I've ever been involved in putting together, because it simply works,
So, what do you believe makes a story strong, personally?
Well, it's tough to and having taught a few story classes, it's really difficult to tell why a story works. The one thing that a story must do, though, of course, is it's got to connect with the audience. If it doesn't connect, you're out of business. The characters must resonate with the audience. If they don't, nobody's going to care what's going on. Now, the trick to this whole thing is, well, then how do you do that? It's one thing to say it, but how do you do it? How do you do it? How do you make it work? Well, a lot of it is just simply trial and error. You try something and you fail. You try it again and you fail. And then you try it again and you fail. Well, eventually, with that try and fail, eventually you hopefully succeed. And that's what we did. Our path to creating that story on Toy Story 2 was not an easy one. And there were many rough patches along the way. There were cuts of the film where I felt like we had fallen on our face. There were times during the making of that film where I thought, oh my gosh, we're headed in the wrong direction. This is not working at all. But having been through this process any number of times, I knew that, as my old friend Joe Ramp would say, you have to trust the process. So you trust the process and you keep going. And you keep going till you get it right. And hopefully, at the end of the day, you'll have a solid story and a darn good film. Well, that's what we eventually had on Toy Story 2. A solid film and a darn good story. But it took a lot of people to make that happen. It took a lot of people working together, trying and failing to pull the story together and make it work. And when it works, it really works. And that's what makes this business, this whole crazy enterprise, so worthwhile.
So, what's the studio of Pixar like? What's the atmosphere like there?
When I got to Pixar back in 1997, it was my first visit to Pixar. I found it very much like the Walt Disney Studio. But I'll add to that to say it was much like the Walt Disney Studio in its early days, when it was a brand new, untried studio. And so that's the fun part about coming into an enterprise when it's just getting on its feet, before it's had, successes, when it's still struggling. That's the exciting time to be part of a new studio, because anything can happen, because everything is fresh and new. Everybody is, for the most part, young and untried. A lot of ideas are untried, unproven, and it's just a very exciting time to work in the studio. So for me, coming to Pixar, it was a lot like Disney, but a lot like early Disney, and I think that's part of the studio's success, I think.
By any chance, have you been in the secret room at Pixar?
It seems that every studio has a secret room. Yeah, I've heard about the secret room, though I've not had a chance to crawl through that little crawl space and get in there. Even though I've been to Pixar many times, I just never had the opportunity, or maybe the invitation, to go into that special room. But I have been in secret rooms in other studios, so it seems to be kind of an animation thing where everybody wants to have a secret room that they like to brag about. I don't know. It's just what cartoonists do, I suppose.
So did you have your own office at Pixar?
Yes, I did. Yes, I did during my time at Pixar. And keep in mind, I was there from off and on from 1997 to 1999. So even though I wasn't really a full-time employee of Pixar because I was being loaned to Pixar by Disney, my producer at Pixar um, decided I was not a visitor because when I first came in, I was wearing a visitor's pass. And the producer walked up to me and she ripped the pass off my shirt and says, "You're not a visitor. You are an employee of Pixar." So I guess it depends on how you want to look at it.
Now, I'm aware that John Lasseter encourages his employees to customize their office. So did you customize yours when you became an employee at Pixar?
Oh, yes. Yes, you're right about that. Yeah, that's very true about Pixar does have a lot of creative freedom when it comes to, let's say, embellishing one's office, one's workspace, where people have built all manner of things in their cubicle or their office space. I believe one person built sort of a Tahitian hut complete with palm fronds and tiki gods and that sort of thing. So yeah, he does. He does encourage a creative atmosphere. I must confess, I never did anything to my space because I think I was too busy working to have the time to be going out trying to customize my workspace. But many people did, and I suppose they still do to this day.
Now, Mr. Lasseter is known for his incredible boundless energy. So what was your first impression of him when you met him?
Yeah, that's a funny thing. When people ask me about John Lasseter, once again, John Lasseter for me is sort of like Walt Disney, like a younger version of Walt Disney, you might say. I really don't know John that well. Keep in mind, when John was a student at Cal Arts, I was already a Disney veteran, having worked at Disney since the 1950s. I and a group of my colleagues would often visit Cal Arts, that is the California Institute of the Arts, the art school that Walt Disney had a large part in funding. So a lot of these young kids who were in training at Cal Arts, John Lasseter being amongst them, to me, I regarded as students. They were kids, and we would go up to look at their work and see how they were doing. So I didn't get a chance to know them all that well. I didn't get a chance to know John that well. And so even though I knew of his work, I knew of his name, I didn't really know him. And so by the time I got to Pixar in 1997, I had known John had been at Pixar for a good 10 years or more. But once again, our paths never crossed, so I never came in contact with him, never able to have a conversation because he was up north at Pixar and I was down at Disney, so we just never got together. My first meetings with John Lasseter was in 1998 when John began to have a few meetings with us on Toy Story 2. And even then, because John was in a meeting, it was very formal and it wasn't the kind of thing where it was a social occasion. So I never spoke with him much. On occasion, I might see John Lasseter in a hallway and say, "Hello, John, how you doing?" and that kind of thing. But it was, very brief. Even today, when I remember going to a luncheon and John Lasseter was there, and My wife spoke to him because I think he knew my wife better than he knew me. But he was telling her how much he had enjoyed the work she had done on the Tinkerbell movie. And I remember going over to John's table where he was seated with his wife and family, and shaking John's hand and saying hello, John. But once again, it was a very brief meeting. It was just exchanging pleasantries. So I really don't know John that well at all, but I do know him as a boss, as a storyteller, and really that's what mattered, because when John came in to give us notes on Toy Story 2, that was really my concern, was getting notes from my director, not so much trying to establish a friendship, you know. So our meetings have been very businesslike. It's always been related to the project or the film we're working on. So as a person, I really know very little about John, but but then again, I think we're from two different generations. You know, he's a younger guy, I'm the older guy, and our paths just didn't cross that much. Of course, they did professionally, but not on a social level.
What about John the director? What is he like?
Um, Great, great. I mean, he was great to work with on Toy Story 2, and his notes and his comments were dead on. I think I mentioned that in my new book, Animated Life, that the direction we got from John when he finally came on to Toy Story was good, solid notes, much the same way Walt Disney would have given us notes. John immediately spotted the problems in the story, gave us pointers on what things we should deal with, what things we should work on, where the weak points were, where the problems were, and that's what a good director does. A good director is not just directing the movie; he's directing the story. And John's got a good story sense. Walt Disney was a gifted story editor, and I see some of those same qualities in John Lasseter.
So I'm completely obsessed with Disney and Pixar documentaries. I watch them religiously, and I'm very curious to know, have you seen any?
Oh yeah. Oh yes, yes. I love documentaries. I'm a big fan of documentaries anyway. I love watching them, no matter what subject they're on. The subject of animation is of a particular interest to me. So I've seen documentaries about the Walt Disney Studio, about certain Disney artists. Certainly, I've seen the Pixar Story, which was a documentary that Leslie Iwerks directed a few years ago. That was very enjoyable. I was invited to a screening in downtown Pasadena where she initially screened the film when it was being put up for an Academy Award. So yeah, I love documentaries. I love seeing the inside of this business, going behind the curtain, as it were, to see how the business works. And I think a lot of other people do too. I think what's fascinating about this medium is not just the finished product, but how you get to that finished product and what's involved along the way. The choice of voice actors, why the artists, you know, designed the characters a particular way, why the color styling, why the music. I mean, it's just the whole thing fascinates me, and I love every aspect of film production. I think I always have. So a documentary just gives you the opportunity, at least it gives the filmmakers the opportunity to share what goes on behind the curtain.
So, which Disney Studio documentary would you say is your favorite?
Wow, I don't know if we've made the definitive documentary yet. There have been several ones that I've enjoyed. Wow, Ted Thomas. I love the documentary he did about his father and Ollie Johnson.
Mm.
But that's focusing on two animators. I love that. I love the documentary Ted Thomas did on Walt Disney and the trip to South America, Walt and El Grupo. I love the documentary that Diane Disney Miller did on her father, Walt Disney, the man behind the myth. And I certainly enjoyed the wonderful documentary that Peter Schneider and Don Hahn produced
Waking Sleeping Beauty.
Waking Sleeping Beauty.
Oh,
Right, right.
I fell in love with that
Yeah,
movie. I
yeah,
really did. Oh,
yeah.
I got that on a Christmas day, and
Wonderful.
like I was just so excited. I was just so excited just to see a clearer vision of the Disney
Yeah,
Renaissance in the 90s. I wanted the picture to be painted so badly.
yeah, yeah. Yeah. I enjoyed it very much as well, and plus I had the opportunity to watch the movie at a screening at the El Capitan Theater in downtown Hollywood, along with most of the people who were part of that whole amazing decade. A lot of the artists, a lot of the studio personnel who were a part of that marvelous period were there gathered together when Peter Schneider, our former boss of animation, and Don Hahn, our producer, came on stage to basically just say this film is a celebration of that glorious time, that magical time when Walt
Mm.
Disney animation was at its zenith. You know, it was a renaissance of sorts, but a second renaissance at the Walt Disney Studio, where we produce films like The Little Mermaid and Beauty and the Beast and Aladdin and The Lion King, you know, hit after hit, and just a marvelous time. And to be there with the people who did that, and to be there to watch the film and watch that piece of history, and to know that we were a part of it, was just really a glorious moment.
Mm. I noticed that you were credited as a characterist for the film Waking Sleeping Beauty. So I was wondering which pictures of yours were shown in the film.
Yes, Don Hahn wanted to use cartoons. You know, he wanted to plug in cartoons in the narrative
Mm.
because he felt that the gags that we drew expressed so well what was going on at the time. So I don't remember all the gags I did because I did so many gags. I tend, when I start drawing gags, I tend to draw hundreds of them. But I know that one gag in particular I did because it was at a very somber and sad time. It was when animation was being evicted, as it were, from the animation building. And I drew this cartoon of this poor widow and a Simon Legree character with the handlebar mustache, dressed in black, you know, as he serves the eviction notice, and he's kicking the poor animators out of the animation building, and they're being exiled to far off Glendale. And I know that that was one sketch that was used in the film, and I know that Don Hahn wanted to include that. I felt honored that he chose that cartoon to use in the documentary.
Well, yeah, I definitely think that the choice of using sketches really elevates the film and creates a tone for it.
Yeah, yeah, it does, because after all, that's what we do. We are cartoonists, we are storytellers, cartoon makers, and nothing drives the point home like a good cartoon.
I definitely agree. Have you ever considered directing your own cartoon?
Oh, I would love to direct an animated feature film, but I think for me that time has passed. I'm nearly 78 years old now. It's just a reality that most directors today are younger. They are certainly nowhere near my age. Most directors are probably in their 30s, maybe 40s would might be the age of most, but certainly nobody in their 60s or 70s would be given the opportunity to direct an animated film today. So I think age alone disqualifies me. Uh, who knows about the whole thing of talent? If I have even the talent to be a director, I would have loved to been a director on a feature length film. Back when I was younger, the opportunity seemed to come my way on occasion. It never happened. But then again, for a lot of people, it doesn't happen. Because keep in mind, there are only so many films made. There are only so many people who can be given the job as a film director. And those jobs are not easily come by. So a lot of times it's just a matter of luck, of being in the right place at the right time. Not just a matter of talent. I think you also have to be lucky enough to be given the job. So while it's a job that I would love to have taken on when I was a younger artist, I know that chances are at this stage in my life that's not going to happen. So I certainly don't entertain any thoughts of directing a feature film at my age. But would I love to do it? The answer is yes. Of course I would. I would jump at the chance. I would jump at the chance any day, because it's a funny thing. At my advanced age now, I wouldn't be as nervous about it. I wouldn't be as apprehensive. I would realize that it's just a movie, and it's not a matter of life and death. When you go out to make a movie, certainly it's a huge responsibility. It involves a lot of people and a lot of time and a lot of money. But at the end of the day, no one's going to die, So I think it's a matter of just keeping things in perspective, and just focusing on doing a good film and telling a good story. So I would probably be more qualified today, because it wouldn't freak me out as much as, say, if I had been a younger man. But I do know that chances are that's not going to happen. But it's a nice thought anyway.
Right, okay. So if you were given the chance to direct any animated feature from your lifetime, which would you pick?
I think the Disney masterpiece I've always chosen has been Pinocchio. A lot of people would have said Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, but I've always thought that Pinocchio seemed to be the film that brought everything together. I mean, it was Walt Disney. It was the Walt Disney Studio, and Walt Disney in particular, at their best. I mean, they had already had a hit film with Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. The studio was mature enough to take on another challenge. And Walt chose Pinocchio because it would challenge his artists. It would challenge his animators. And I thought they did a magnificent job. To me, it is truly the Disney masterpiece. And had it not been for the events of the time, who knows what the studio might have done next. It's amazing how events impact, an artist or an enterprise. The World War II coming in the early 40s, and of course the famous Disney strike. These things changed the studio forever. They reshaped the Walt Disney Studio, and I think it made Walt Disney Studios a totally different company. If the war hadn't happened, if the strike hadn't happened, Disney today might be a totally different company. Would it have been better or worse? Who knows? But it certainly would have been different. So I think history has a way of impacting the things these things that go on in our life, and it changes things. But at the time, Pinocchio in the early 40s was a Disney masterpiece. And I think that if Walt Disney and his artists had been allowed to continue and move on to even greater things, who knows what might have happened. But anyway, the studio is still here. They did go on to make other films, but I don't think they ever reached that peak ever again that they had reached. That artistic pinnacle in Pinocchio was just Disney, and the Disney studio at its very best.
Yeah, I agree that Pinocchio is definitely one of Disney's best. I need to rewatch it, actually. However, many people believe that the studio is at its worst when it produces a sequel to a hit classic. Interestingly enough, you have been involved with a few Disney sequels yourself. So do you agree that Disney sequels are made solely for commercial piggybacking, or do you think that they have a more sincere intention?
Oh, maybe the Walt Disney Company wouldn't be happy to hear this, but I think those sequels were very definitely motivated by money. It couldn't have been much else, because really there was no need for a sequel to Cinderella, and there was no need for a sequel to any number of those marvelous Disney films that came out. The motivation was clearly, sad to say, and I think even Walt Disney would agree, the motivation was simply easy money, because it was a product that was already pre-sold. So all you had to do was make a film, put it on the shelves, and people would buy it. Now, did we need a sequel to Cinderella? No. Story had already wrapped up. Happy ending. There was no place else to go. Did we need a sequel to Jungle Book, Jungle Book 2? No, we had already wrapped the story up in the feature film. The movie ended where it should have ended. Walt Disney gave us the ending, and the story was over. No need for a sequel. So why make a sequel? Well, the only motivation would have been money. And I'm sad to say that that sad period in Disney's history had to happen, but I'm grateful that it's come to a close. Now, this is not to say that sequels shouldn't be made. After all, a notable sequel was Toy Story 2. Now, that's a sequel, but we had a reason for making that film, and there was more to it than making money. We had a story to tell, and we told it well, and it was a darn good movie. So, sequels are not always off the table, and I would never say we should never, ever make a sequel, because sometimes a sequel is not a bad idea, and it could be a very good film. But there are a lot of sequels that really should not be made.
So how come you got involved with these Disney sequels despite knowing that motivation behind the company?
Yeah, it makes me sound like a bit of a hypocrite, doesn't it? Having been involved with these, it was, for me, my not working on the film would not have stopped the film from being made. It would be like a pointless boycott of the movie by saying, I disagree with this film, and so I absolutely refuse to work on it because I think it's a horrific idea. Well, no, I knew that at the time management was moving in that direction. I knew nothing I could say or do would change management's decision. By my working on the film or not working on the film would not change anything. So because I love what I do and I love animation, I had the opportunity to work on a Disney motion picture. So I did just that. I thought, well, if we're going to do a sequel, let's at least try to do the best job possible. And I remember when I worked on Cinderella too, I remember going back on looking at the original film and trying to pull as much from that original film as possible. So at least we would be true to the original. So at least the film would hopefully have some integrity. Not a lot, but hopefully some integrity. And the same way with other sequels I worked on. Now, I've since apologized. I still felt that, well, maybe I kind of wimped out and maybe I should have just turned my back on these sequels altogether. But an old cartoonist like me, wants to work. And when a job comes my way, it's difficult to turn it down because I love the medium, I love animation, and I love the opportunity to work on a Disney film, even if I'm not in total agreement with that film being made. So that's my answer for my reluctant participation in the Disney sequels.
Mm-hmm. Well, what's interesting is that I spoke to Elliot Bohr, the director of Emperor's New Groove 2, and he says that the people behind the Disney animated sequels, the actual artists, the animators, they have good intentions. Would you agree?
Yes, I would agree. Yeah, I believe the artists always want to do their best work. I mean, nobody goes into a motion picture thinking I'm just going to, do a slipshod job. The artists want to do their best, and we take the work seriously. I know that when I was storyboarding on sequels, I didn't look at it as, okay, I'm just going to, do a slapdash job and knock this out. I wanted to do the best work I could do. I knew that I was doing this work within a story or a framework that I wasn't exactly delighted with. But these are the choices you have to make. But so you kind of have to be true to yourself and your own integrity as an artist, and do the best job you can possibly do. And that's about all any artist can do or say. If they don't have a fantastic property to work on and they have to work on something a little less fantastic, well, a job is still a job, and we do what we do. And so, I would never blame the artist and saying that they were going to do less of a job because it's a sequel.
Now, what advice would you give to someone who wants to join the animation industry?
Well, first of all, if you want to become a part of this very interesting business, I would recommend that you sincerely be in love with it because it's a job that's not always going to be peaches and cream. It's not always going to be up, up, up. There will be down periods. And so I always tell young animation students that it's important to love this job. I came into it not because I wanted a profession, but because I was in love with animation. I truly love the medium. I truly love the films of Disney, the films of UPA, the films of Hanna-Barbera, Warner Brothers. I love the medium, and I was kind of like devoted to it. It's kind of like for us old animators, it's kind of like a religion. And so I said, go into the business knowing that, and go into the business knowing that it's not always going to be fun and games, and there'll be times when you will question yourself. You'll wonder, why did I ever choose this crazy business when I could have become a doctor or a lawyer or some other job where I could earn real money. But so I think it requires a dedication and a commitment. And if that's what you want to do, and that's what you're committed to, then do it. By all means, do it. I did, and I look back on my career with no regrets. I did what I wanted to do. I had a great time doing it, and I would do it all over again if I could.
Would you give any suggestions to those who want to pursue a career animation? A suggestion for what they can do for now until they have the opportunity to join the industry?
Oh, yes. As an artist, you have to practice your craft. I used to be sort of an amateur musician when I was a kid because I loved music. So I took violin lessons, and I learned to play the clarinet and the saxophone and the flute, mainly because I just loved music. I knew that I didn't have the talent or the musical chops to be a professional. I did it for sheer enjoyment. But what I did learn was that if you're going to be good at what you do, you have to be committed to it and you have to do it every day. So that is, if you want to be a musician, you have to play every day. You have to live and breathe music. If you want to be an artist, you have to live and breathe art. And that means a day can't go by when you're not drawing or painting, because that's how you grow. That's how you get better. So if you're a young artist and you are destined to be an animation artist, this is what you want to do with your life, then you must, by all means, practice your craft any and every way you can. You must draw every day. You must paint every day. If you're able to, animate every day. And I was able to make my own films way back in the 1950s when I was just a kid, when the tools and the things that you needed to make an animated film, you simply couldn't go to a store and buy. A lot of the tools I needed, I had to actually make myself. Today, there's all kinds of technology available, making the process so much easier. So a young filmmaker has amazing tools at his or her disposal today. The computer that enables you to edit films in a way that we couldn't even conceive of when I was a kid. So the main thing I would say is practice your craft. If this is what you want to do when you are a professional, then do it now. That is, become a professional even before you become a professional. Start doing it now. I was doing animation tests when I was still a kid in middle school because I knew that one day I would be doing an animation test at the Walt Disney Studio. And when that day came, I wanted to be ready. So I started doing animation tests when I was a kid, preparing myself for that day that was at least 8 to 10 years in my future. But I began to prepare myself then, as you should prepare yourself now.
Oh, I definitely agree. I mean, I recently finished a student animation called Mel and the Devil's Deal, and there was so much I learned from just the process of animating, the practice of animating. I mean, after making that student animation, I had this new perspective on the animation process, an enlightened understanding of the illusion of movement.
Yeah, you have to. It's the only way you're going to learn. It's the only way you're going to grow. You cannot wait for it to come. You have to start doing it now. Yeah, and today there's all kinds of resources available.
Yeah, we're a lucky generation for having all this technology. Now, Floyd, seeing how long your career spanned for, what would you say is your proudest achievement in the industry?
I would say probably having the unique and rare opportunity to work with a master like Walt Disney. Keep in mind that when I came to Disney, I never had any idea I would ever work with Walt Disney. Now, I knew that being at the studio, I would probably see Walt Disney and that I might even see him walking down the hallway and be able to speak to Walt Disney. But never in my wildest imagination could I ever have imagined that I would be in the same room with the legendary Walt Disney. And when that happened, I would say that has got to be my proudest moment because that doesn't happen to everybody. And so I was a very lucky kid to have been chosen to be given that unique opportunity to work on the Jungle Book, to work on a very special film with some amazingly talented people, and to have the whole thing supervised and directed by Walt Disney. Now, of course, our director was Wolfgang Reitman, but really the man in charge was Walt Disney. And to be there with Walt in the same room was just a very, very proud moment for a young artist hoping to find his way in the animation business. You simply couldn't ask for much better than that.
Mm. Well, I think one of the most inspiring things about Walt, for me, is that he started off as a farm boy, and considering how he went from there all the way to like one of the biggest names in the world with a massive corporation, that inspired me to realize I can start my own animation company, which is my dream, which is what I want to do. And if Walt Disney can go from being a farm boy to a national treasure, then I can go from being a third year student to someone that runs an animation company. So like that's his influence on me personally.
Yeah, I've often spoken about that. It's truly an American story that Walt Disney is much like a Thomas Edison or a Henry Ford, the example of a boy, farm boy from the Midwest without any special family connections, without wealth, without education, lacking in all these things, but having a dream could still achieve that in America, that if you dream hard enough and if you work hard enough, that anything is possible. And if anybody has proven that anybody could make it, that you don't need to be from a special family, you don't need to be from wealth, you don't need to have stature. You can be a simple farm boy and become the leader of a huge corporation. It just shows that anything is possible.
Absolutely. Well, Floyd, thank you for taking the time to talk to me.
You're very welcome. It's been my pleasure.
I hope that my listeners enjoyed listening to this interview with Floyd Norman. It's really inspiring to know how many different things that he dipped into throughout his career. If you'd like to know a bit more about Floyd, then head to his blog, which is Mr. Fun. That's at mrfun.squarespace.com/blog. You can also contact him on Twitter at Floyd Norman. You can also find loads of different Floyd Norman videos all over YouTube that I encourage you to go and check out. If you'd like to check out anything else that I've produced, then head to Jambareeqi.com. You're also welcome to contact me on Twitter at Jambareeqi. See you guys!